Today is March 30th, 2024. We're here to interview Roma Mintz, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. The interviewer is Esther Andor, and the videographer is Robert Wilson. We're doing the interview under the auspices of the Yossi Shoah Foundation, and the interview will be in English. And record. So good afternoon, Roma.
Hi, Esther.
Thank you very much for accepting.
Thank you for coming here, you and Robert.
I will ask you, when you're talking, talk to me, not to him, not to the camera.
Yes, thank you for, yeah, great.
So my very first question is if you could tell me your first name and last name, and if you could spell both of them.
My name is Roma Mintz, Romaminc.
What was your name at birth?
I don't know, because I was born during the war, and my parents were on Aryan papers, so, and I'm not registered anywhere. I'm not a person of where I was born. So I really, that's a good question. I have no idea. I would doubt it was Roma Mintz. I would imagine it was something Piotrowski, whatever my parents said, Aryan papers said.
Could you tell me where you were born?
I was born in Sosnowiec, Poland.
And when?
May 1st, 1941.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about your grandparents, whatever you know or you heard about your grandparents. So let's start with your mother's parents.
So my mother's parents, my maternal grandfather was Mordechai Hatzadik, they called him, because he was a Ger Chassid. And he and my grandmother had the equivalent of like a department store. Not like it was a department store. And my grandmother's name was Frumit Dina. She was not from a Ger Chassid family, but she was obviously ultra religious. So one of the things that I've been told about my grandparents, not by my parents, neither of my parents. I used to go to the funerals of people from their organization, Zavierce and Vicinity Organization. And I'd go there every night, and I would sit and listen to the stories. And they would talk about my grandparents because they were really very honorable people. They were very privileged, but they shared their privilege. They had a fund for brides who couldn't afford a wedding, a dress, whatever. They gave out money, that wasn't an issue, but they also gave loans, free interest loans. So everyone had something nice to say about my grandparents. Funny, eh? No one talked about their children. They didn't know my father's parents, but no one talked about my two uncles and aunt.
What was the last name of that family?
My grandfather's name was Kravitz. My grandmother's maiden name was Milstein. No, that's not true. There were survivors, but they came before the war. So my grandfather had a brother and a sister in Montreal. My grandmother had no survivors. No. And Esther, you helped me remember that they sponsored us, the brother and sister sponsored us. And I remember they picked us up at the station because we came by boat to Halifax, Nova Scotia. From there, we came by train to Montreal, and they picked us up, they being one of the children. And we went to their house, and the first thing they did, and I remember this clearly, as I remember, it was that my parents didn't have suitcases. They had pillowcases. Now that might be a mismemory, but I remember the first thing that this family did. These were the brother and sister, and we were just through something horrible. I think Canadians knew all along, as did the world. But anyway, I think at this point they were very clear what was happening or what happened to us. And they looked for the gold and the diamonds and the whatever. And the only thing my parents really had, God only knows why, was this beautiful little, like a teapot and a little container for sugar or for milk or whatever. But it was very little, very beautiful. Of course, I broke them, but that's another story. And they were disgusted by that. You know, this is all you have? So it wasn't exactly a hearty welcome with balloons and banners. They also didn't want to have anything to do with us. It was a terrible time for us, but not only us, anybody who came after the war. And I think it was in part due to the fact that the people, the Jews who were here, were suffering from survivor's guilt. They had it pretty good in comparison to what and we were the dregs of the world when you think about it. By dregs, I'm not sure if that's the right word. We were like skeletons. We were like these sci-fi programs they have. I can't identify it. Anyway, so they found us a place, Lickety Split, and it was on Mayor Street. Mayor Street at that time was a residential. It was really the slums, but not the slums. They're Uber slums, a little bit better. And they put us into this, they found us this place. Well, I should mention that they lived in a lovely, lovely, lovely neighborhood. Beautiful house, huge rooms, huge ceilings. It was a triplex, they owned it, opposite Fletcher's Field. Now, if you come to Montreal, you could see these homes, and they're really very magnificent. So they found this place for us on Mayor Street. It was 2 rooms. One of them was the bedroom for all of us, all meaning my brother, my parents, and I. And the other one was a kitchen, a living room, etc. I don't have any feelings attached to that place at all, except for a little incident that happened. We shared a bathroom. I guess on each floor, I can't really, it wasn't a huge place we were in. And one day I went out to the bathroom and I came upon a couple in the bathtub. I quickly ran to my mother and said, "There's a man and a woman in the bathtub." Well, believe me, it wasn't long before they found another place to live. And so my blood relatives really abandoned us. Little did they know how we would end up in life. My brother has received every possible award in Canada. He got a Governor General. He has an award he's the first Jewish Chief Justice in Montreal. I mean, I could go on and on and on, and I'm not a slouch either. I worked as a psychiatric social worker in one of the hospitals, and then I was on very many decision-making committees. At that time, there was talk about merging, and indeed we end up merging, and I was the chairperson of the multidisciplinary committee that includes everyone. We had some medical people, but basically it's everyone except the doctors. I had a lot of important positions. I did get one award, not like my brother though. Okay, so that's.
I'll go back.
Okay.
You ran very
Okay, all right.
ahead, but that's fine.
Okay.
We're talking about your grandparents on your mother's side. You didn't tell me what town they lived in.
I think they lived in Zavierce. My grandparents lived in Zavierce. And I think you asked me about memories of my grandparents. So.
Or stories that you heard about them.
Okay. Well, the stories that I heard about them were really stories from my mother's landsman, people.
That's fine.
Yeah. My mother never talked about her wealth, nor did my father. Never, ever. But what I remember is we had an event in honor of my daughter's engagement at the Montefiore Club. The Montefiore Club was, it closed unfortunately, was a setting for people, for Jews, because most of the other places didn't let Jews in. So they established themselves. And really you had to, I mean, it wasn't for the poor people to be a member. I'm saying that because when we walked in, there was a huge menorah in silver. It was quite, I wish I could tell the size, but women aren't great with that. So it was huge, and my mother looked at it, and she whispered in my ear in Yiddish. She said, like, as if the other party members didn't speak Yiddish. But anyway, she said, if you think that's big, you should have seen the one we had in our house. And I'm sure my mother was spot on. She never lied, and certainly not about that. So I had confirmation that she was privileged in many ways. There was an arranged marriage with a chassid for her. And this is a story she told me on the way in the car, because she complained to my sister-in-law that we go on trips and she doesn't talk to me. So I thought, oh, I better start asking her questions. So I said, tell me about, like, did you have a boyfriend before Danny? And she said, I didn't have a boyfriend, but an arranged engagement was to be. And he came by the house, and he was taking me for coffee and cake or tea or whatever, and he expected my father to pay for it. We went on the whatever, the rendezvous, I don't know what word she used, and when she came home, she said to her father, Tatasha, this is not going to work. And it's very interesting because he didn't agree with her in terms of that, but he did agree that she could get out of the marriage. And she said to me, he had to pay the promised dowry, which was $5,000 US. And I looked at her and I thought, for a bright woman, I really have some dumb spots. I said, dollars? She says, Roma, what did you think people trade with? I said, back then? So $5,000 back then was a lot of money. But more interestingly is that imagine a chassid, from what I know of Hasidim, having a discussion with his daughter, like, what's a woman, and then agreeing to let her do this. I think it's quite remarkable. Esther, you asked me what my mother did, and I told you she didn't do anything. She was busy being sent to spas and because she was very skinny. So they were worried, you know. She didn't do anything. She really didn't do anything. Oh, excuse me. She told me again, about, she's always loved gossip about movie stars. And so she'd get these movie magazines. And again, I thought she was lying because, I mean, like and again, oh, Romola, you know, what do you think? You know, if you had the money, you got everything. And she loved it. Till the day she died, she loved those kind of things. In fact, one Pesach, she wasn't a great cook, and I'm not either. And so one day she made this marvelous Pesach, a Pesach, it's not a souffle, like a potato something or other. And we were all amazed and in awe, and everyone was saying, everyone being my brother and sister-in-law, my father, and I had 2 children at that time, and I think my niece was born. Oh, where did you get it? So she started to laugh. She excused herself from the room, and she went into the den, came back with the Esquire magazine. So for those of you who don't know, Esquire is like gossip. I guess you have it in the States too. I don't know. Anyway, and it was hilarious because to the day she died, we knew what to buy her for an occasion, Esquire magazine.
And these movie magazines that you mentioned, she had them before the war?
Yes.
Her father, the Guerra Hasidim.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. You know, she abandoned God during the war and after the war, although she prided herself, I never ate chazer. Even when we had nothing to eat, I never ate chazer. Little did she know that the spare ribs in Chinatown were chazer. We never told her about that. I don't even think it was on our mind. It's not like we lied to her. She was a remarkable woman. When Morgenthaler's clinic was Morgenthaler's, it was an abortion clinic. He was quite an amazing man, and the service was for free. It was wonderful. There was a question, many years later, there was a question of it being illegal, and they had to disband it, etc. Well, my mother got into a huff, and she said, what business is it of anyone's what I do with my body? And I said, whoa, Mommy, good for you. She said, well, you know, I had an abortion. I said, Mommy, good for you. When? She said, well, during the war, before you were born. I said, really? Why? She said, that wasn't a place to raise children. Well, P.S., shortly after she got pregnant with me, but that would have been her Orthodox guilt, I would imagine. We never talked about it.
Going back to your grandparents, how many children did they have? They had your mother?
My grandparents had 3 children, 2 boys and my mother, a girl. The eldest son, pardon me, don't remember his name at the moment. Abraham, that's right, thank you. Abraham, he had a daughter, Leah, and a wife. My mother would call her Leila, and every Montauk and Donishtik, we'd hear about Leila, who loved to dance with her hand, and my mother would go, Leila, tanz. And her younger brother, my mother was very, very beautiful and obviously very Aryan-looking. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten Aryan papals. She was blonde. She had like hazel eyes. She had a little nose, which my brother inherited. I did not. And she was very, very clever.
We're talking about the younger brother.
Oh, thank you.
What happened to, because I was going to ask
yes.
what happened to each of them during the war.
Yes. So they must have just been taken somewhere, to Auschwitz or somewhere. I don't know. Probably. I mean, my grandfather didn't want to leave. You know, I guess he believed I don't know, we never talked about it, but I would imagine he, like all Hasidim, they believed that God will take care of them. It wasn't the money. He wasn't attached to his property. That wasn't the value in the house. From what I gathered from the values that our parents gave my brother and I. And so the youngest one, we found out on a visit to Israel from someone who knew him, that he was beautiful. He was blonde, blue eyes, and of course, payas. Those are what religious Jews have, the boys. They have the curly cues. I don't know what it is in English. And they used to torment him. And this we got from the witness.
Torment him where? In the camp?
In Auschwitz, yes. And one day he just ran out and threw himself against the wire. He was younger. He, in fact, begged my mother to leave, because my grandparents told, when my father came back from France, he was studying in Paris at the Sorbonne. When he came back from France, he said, we have to leave. And my grandparents wouldn't leave. And Abraham, I guess there was no discussion. My mother never talked about Abraham and his family. But the younger one, Bercha, wanted to come. And he said, you take me. I have a lot of watches. The Polish people love watches. Take me. Well, it wasn't enough that my mother had survivor's guilt. When she heard this story, that kind of put another nail in the coffin. Yes.
And why wouldn't your mother take him with her?
Thank you for asking. Well, what she said is, and she told me this, she told us this, she said that she told him, stay here, you have to be with mommy and daddy. Because I guess Abraham had his own place. And needless to say, imagine the guilt of, my mother survived, so he would survive, and plus, anyway.
Let's move on to your father's parents. What do you know about them?
Well, thank God they died before the war.
What was their names?
My father's name was Mintz. It was originally Mintz, but his father wanted to, I don't know what the word is, Polonize it. And so he changed it to Minc as in Charles. And he worked for the Polish government. He was an accountant. And that's my paternal grandfather. My maternal grandmother, my paternal grandmother died, and my father called it cholera. But I would imagine, because given that he had a history of pre-colon cancer, I would imagine she died of colon cancer. But he did call it cholera, and he was a medical student, so he would have known something. But I find that interesting.
What was her name?
Her name was Freda Razel. I'm named after her. A friend of mine asked my mother, why did you name your daughter Roma? She said, what did you want me to call her during the war? Freda Razel? That wasn't her tone, but.
So you said they both died before the war?
Yes, of natural causes. I don't know what my paternal grandfather died.
And how many children did they have?
Well, my grandmother was my grandfather's second wife. So he and she had 2 children, boys. My father and his brother also died, was murdered. He didn't die. And the other people, I don't know. I just met one in Israel. I don't know how many there were.
That's from the first marriage?
Yes.
Do Do you know if they were religious?
No, but certainly in comparison to me, they were religious. I mean, because everybody was.
But nothing like her maternal.
Not at all. They were, no.
Where did they live?
I don't know. I would imagine where my father was born, and I didn't know that city until today.
Let's move on to your parents. What was your father's name?
My father's name is, well, he was born, yeah, because it would have been before the war, and named Shimon Benjamin Simcha Benim in Yiddish, Mintz, M-I-N-T-Z, he was born. Too bad I don't have any paperwork on that, eh?
And do you know what year he was born in?
He was born on June 10th, 1917.
You mentioned that he was studying at Sorbonne.
Yes.
What kind of studies?
Medicine.
Medicine.
Yeah.
And he came back during the war. So let's move to your mother first. What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was, well, she also would have been given a Jewish name. Her name was Mirala. I don't know if she must have had a middle name. They all seem to have had, but I don't know it. Mirala Kravitz. Mirala Kravitz. And she was born February 10th, it says on one of the papers, 1917.
15, no? You said she was older than your father.
Yes.
So he was born in 1917, then she was born in 1915.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's correct.
What kind of education did she have?
She went to Bes Yaakov, which is Beit Yaakov. She finished high school.
And then, as you said, she didn't work.
No, she didn't work.
Do you know how your parents met? Because they weren't even from the same city, not from the same social circles.
I don't. I know that they were in love. I know that part. But I don't know where they met. We never asked questions. You know, my brother for sure not. And I never did. I never asked questions, which is so interesting because my career is all about asking questions and not talking. And we never heard sei still. Oh, that's not true. We never heard don't ask questions. There was always a ruckus around some intellectual or non-intellectual discussion, and certainly as we had kids, my brother and I, my God, the ruckus that went on between those kids. But we learned early that something happens. And we learned that what I'm clear about when it hit me was when my mother, and I was young, I was a little kid, I don't know, 11, 12. And my mother was lighting the candles and she was bawling hysterically. It was like a moaning cry. It was awful. And I said to her, because I was such an empathic person, which is interesting, because I went on to be in a career that you have to at least intellectually be empathic. I said to my mother, just, if lighting these candles makes you so sad, just don't light them anymore. And in fact, she did stop, not because of what I said, but at some point she stopped. Then she started again. So she had, I talked about her brothers already. Yeah.
No, but what I wanted to ask you, since
Yes,
we
please.
to this topic, is you said you learned early on not to ask questions. How did you learn that? How did you pick that up?
Well, I just remember this incident. I didn't say to her, "Why are you crying?" Which would be the, you know, I just said, "Just don't do it." So, and we didn't ask questions. If we ever did, we were certainly answered. There wasn't any bubba mices in my house, although my father was a big optimist and he could put a nice view on anything and everything. But my mother was a realist, till of course he died. Then all of a sudden she got to be optimistic. The balance of a marriage. We just knew. We knew. Like even when after she squealed on me to my sister-in-law that I never talked to her in the car, I never asked her questions about her experiences in the war, and I wish I did, because she had some terrible experiences. She left me as a little girl, 4 years old, in some place, and to have my brother, her baby, and I had beautiful locks, and they shaved my hair. I must have had lice. I mean, I remember stories about that when we talked about memories. And yet I never said to her, which I would to a stranger, "How did that affect you? What was it like?" She just told me that, that they were all had their mothers besides them and she didn't.
When you were born?
When my brother.
When your brother was
Yeah. When I was born, it was a different story.
We'll come to that, but your parents meet somewhere, we don't know where, and then your father comes back from Sorbonne when the war starts. And then what happens? They get married?
They get married right away. And my grandfather arranged for Aryan papers. Should I explain what that is, or people will know?
No, people will know.
Okay, good. And we were off. I must have been born already. But my grandmother didn't. My grandfather, no one came to the hospital. I must have been born because I was on somewhere. I saw a paper that included me in the Aryan status. Isn't that interesting? Interesting for me. I never realized that.
But it could have been added afterwards.
Okay, well, I don't know. Okay, I do have a memory of my grandfather holding me and in his arms. Well, I couldn't have the memory. It must have been. Oh, sorry. It must have been a story that I was told, and my grandfather would be rocking and singing to me, I guess, religious melodies. Yeah.
So they had false Aryan papers. What was their names?
Piotrowski. My mother was Sophia, and my father, I don't remember.
I know that you have some of those papers.
Yes, I do.
And I looked at the date. Those were issued in 1942. So there may have been papers before that, or they may just have gotten them when,
Well, that would make sense then, eh? So I was 1 year, but I know that my grandparents weren't at my birth, because one of the things that my mother told me about is that the woman beside her was yelling, "Oy, mamishka, mamishka." No, my mother didn't make it that way. She didn't make faces. She said, "Oy, mamishka, mamishka." And she said, all I could think of, how lucky you are to have your mother with you. Yeah.
So at some point they had false papers, maybe even before you were born. And then where did they go? So what was their life during the war? What did they tell you?
All I know is that we were all over the place. And
Meaning?
sorry, all over Poland.
Yeah, but meaning like
From one town to another. We never stayed any place more than 2 days, 3 days. At the beginning, they had their suitcases stuffed with food, and salami is the thing that sticks out in my mind. And they paid people, as I mentioned earlier on. My mother came from a fortunate background, so she had a lot of money and jewels, and I think she wore two fur coats, one on top of the other, whatever, you know. I mean, it really amazes me thinking about it, how these two people who weren't conniving at all, never took anything from anyone, survived like this. The strength they had, it was amazing. To me, it's just incroyable. I mean,
were they hiding together?
not always. No, they never hid together. No, they were never together.
Why?
Because my father was circumcised. And the first thing they did with a man that they thought was Jewish is they made them, according to my parents, toss down their pants. But my father obviously looked very Aryan also. Otherwise, how could he get the papers? But they did meet periodically. So once I was small, but I was very articulate. And so I was on the balcony yelling to whomever wanted to hear, "There's a strange man up here with my mother."
As I'm giving them a fright. Your parents, did they speak Polish as well as Yiddish?
My parents were fluent in my parents were fluent in Polish, without an accent, which is very interesting. Polish, German, and Yiddish, of course. My father spoke other languages as well.
What was the language they used with each other and with you after the war, your brother?
Polish.
So you all spoke Polish?
Yes.
Did you learn Yiddish from them, or would they speak Yiddish in front of you when they didn't want you to understand?
No, my parents during the war spoke Polish. When the war ended, there wasn't a word of Polish in my house, in my mother and father's house, ever.
So when you were growing up, they spoke what?
They spoke Yiddish and English, mostly English.
When we talked earlier, you mentioned a few other war memories that you had. One was this balcony scene when you were shouting that there is a strange man, but there were a few others. One was with a sled.
Yes. So it was winter time. They were together. My father was pulling the sled, and all of a sudden he realized that the sled was light, and they turned around and there was no baby, but they found me. I have clear memories of living of the displaced persons camp.
Oh, but that's
later.
So
okay, sorry.
You have another memory. You talked about going to church with your mother.
Oh yeah.
What's that memory?
I wouldn't call that pleasant.
No, I didn't say pleasant. I just
No,
said memory.
sorry. Yeah. So we used to go to church, and my mother was very clear on that, that we had to go to church, and which I find fascinating, not going to church, but that my mother knew how to pray in Latin in those days, knew how to cross herself, and I, little Miss Obedient, knew how to cross myself, etc. Do you want me to tell you the story of after the war when I saw the Pieta?
We're gonna
Okay.
soon. We're
All
gonna
right.
come to that. But do you have any memories of going to church with your mother?
I
during the
do.
war?
I do.
And what is?
Well, I didn't understand. All I knew that the priest was busy saying the Jews and the Jews and the Juden and the Juden and the Juden. Well, I wasn't a youth, so yeah, that's all I remember. I remember it was very important to go to church. And one time our landlord said, "Aren't you going to church?" Well, the minute that happened, this is what my mom told me, we moved. Like, we didn't stay in one place, but as soon as she sniffed that they may have sniffed out that we weren't real Aryans, we were out of there, lickety-split. My father worked for the should I talk about,
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my father worked for the railroad at one time as a conductor. Can you imagine?
During the war.
Yes, this is during the war. Absolutely, during the war. He liked it. I don't know anything else about that. He was proud, that he worked as a conductor, not menial job. I have a very interesting story about my father, who was somehow a high-ranking Nazi, Gestapo, was enamored with him and hired him to be, I think, like a valet. My father would drive him, my father would everything. The only drawback was that this Gestapo, when he got drunk, and that was regularly, he would swear at the Gestapo. Now, my father's life depended on this man. And so my father was very quick to say, shh, shh, shh. Once the wife the wife and he were entertaining the Gestapo for dinner. And the husband said to my father, "Do you know anyone who could help us?" Now, he knew my father was married, and he was grateful for the offer. And my father said, "Yes, my wife." So she went to help in the kitchen, and my mother didn't know anything about anything in terms of cooking. And so he said, she was peeling her potatoes, and a Gestapo walked through the kitchen, and he looked at her and he said, "You're peeling potatoes like a Juda," which meant that the peel, because that I did ask her, what did he mean? The peel was very thick. Imagine my poor mother with her belly. And then she was ready to leave. Her work was done, and she said she was leaving. And the lady said, the hostess said, "No, you're staying with us for dinner." So my mother was at the table with the Gestapos, and she was amazed. She said to me, "Romola, you wouldn't believe. They talked about the concerts, the music, the theater, the books, etc. Never once about the Jewish problem." I guess you leave your business at home.
Did they ever mention, like you said, that they moved into many places, or do you have any memory of any place you lived or you stayed in during the war, you and your mother?
The only memory I have, I don't remember where it was, like in what city. No, but
not even that.
Yes,
more like
yeah.
places.
A big memory in my life is my mother and I were holding hands. We're looking out of the windows. The windows, as I remember, were ceiling to floor, and there were fireworks. And I remember the feeling that I had, and certainly the feeling in the room. There was no one in the room except my mother and I. I was very tight inside, and my mother was quiet. And I always thought it, all my life, I thought it was fireworks. They were celebrating something. And then at some point, I realized it wasn't fireworks. It was near the end of the war, and they were bombing us. And that's why there was that sense, I don't know if I mentioned that to you, and that's why there was the sense like I was tight as a whatever, and my mother was very solemn. Yeah.
And you know, your father was working for this Gestapo officer. He
Uh,
knew that he had a wife. He never asked, why is the wife not living with him, or were they?
No, he never told me about it. I would, my father would have told that part. You know, he never asked, like, why didn't he ask? No, no, I don't know that. But these are all questions. Wouldn't it be lovely if I asked?
Were your parents ever in dangerous situation, people wanting to denounce them during the war?
Yes, yes.
What did you hear about that?
Well, my mother said, as I said a minute ago, as soon as they make some kind of remark or they looked at her in what she thought was not a friendly manner, she would move out. Now, how did my father know that she moved out? I have no idea.
Yeah, you don't know how they kept in touch.
No.
And would they have visited their parents or were in touch with their parents at all during the war?
No, no, no. I never, ever heard that. And surely I would have.
What other stories did they tell you about the war, other incidents, anything that you haven't mentioned yet? That came back to you since we last spoke.
They didn't say much. They didn't talk about how awful it was. Neither of them were complainers. I think when you're in that situation, you're so busy running like a gerbil on a whatever treadmill that you don't stop to think, oh, this is so terrible. Oh. But my parents were never like that, even after the war. They were grateful.
So where were you at liberation? Do you know where you were liberated?
No, I don't.
Your brother, he was born when?
He was born after the war, 1945. April 28th was the designated, we don't know for sure.
So which means that the war officially has not ended in Europe yet, but Poland was already liberated. He was born, I think, in Lublin.
That's what I think.
Yeah. So at some point they were in Lublin after the war.
Yeah, we looked it up to see if it was near the German border, and it wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what happens to the family after the war? Do you go back to the families?
We never went back, ever, ever, ever. We always went forward.
How did your parents find out that their parents or their relatives had been killed?
Well, they bumped into people. Well, first of all, they looked on lists, right? There were lists. And they also bumped into people. There was one guy who used to tell everyone to go to Israel. Madaf Gain, Madaf Dain. And when my mother bumped into him, she said, Yizikel, what are you doing here? You were telling everyone to go to Israel. And you're here. How come you didn't go? And my mother looked at me and she said, this is what you call a Heise Zionist. Heis is hot, but it also means you tell everyone else to go, but you don't.
Please, yeah. So where did your parents go? Where did your family go after the war? What left Poland?
Well, we went to a DP camp. I don't remember where it was.
Which country? Do you know that?
I always thought it was Austria, but I don't know. I don't know where I got that idea.
Do you have any papers ever that from
No.
the DP camp? Any
No.
documents?
No, I never saw that, no.
And what are your memories of the DP camp? Because you do have a few memories.
I do have. I do have. My fondest memory is walking in the street and picking up orange peels and eating them. And a soldier, I would imagine an American, came up to me and he said, how could he have said? He probably motioned to me and then gave me some sweets or something, some treats. And I remember that. It's interesting. My father always loved Americans. Always loved America. Don't ask me why. We never talked about that. I never asked him. I'm thinking about it now. Yeah, but he loved Canada more.
You have another memory with your father at the town hall meeting? Could you tell me
Yes,
about
that was pretty awful. So I went, the men had a meeting, and there were a lot of men, and it was two-tier. So the upstairs was with the balcony, and my father was upstairs, and I was beside him, and people were yelling and yelling, and then my father spoke. My father was very eloquent. I mean, I know he was eloquent from when I knew him as a child in Montreal and older, etc. And he said, what happened was they were voting on kicking out a capo. Everybody knows what capo is? And my father said, that's not the right thing to do. We cannot judge what it was like for him to do it. What he did was not a good thing, but we should not be kicking out Jews. He's a Jew, he's here, he has a right to be here. Well, he lost his favoritism for that, didn't he? Yeah, so I remember that. That wasn't very pleasant. Another memorable and remarkable memory I have a memory of my father and my brother, but that's not really a memory. That's a picture that we have where my father loved cars, and my brother, they were out, and he put him on the car, and my brother and father are together on the car. But that's not a memory. That's a photo memory. I had a photograph. My brother has it. So another memory that was quite traumatic for me back then. It's not traumatic for me now at all, but certainly at the time. And all these must have had tremendous impacts on who I became. It's also a story of being hidden, because my mother and I went outside of the displaced persons camp, and we went for a walk. At the end of the road was the Pieta, which is as I remember it, Holy Mother, the Virgin Mary holding. It's also in the Vatican, holding Jesus as an adult. And of course, me, the good little Christian, fell to my knees, crossed myself, and prayed. And my mother said, "You don't have to do that anymore. You're not Christian, you're Jewish." And I said, "Ich bin kein Jude, du bist der Jude." Well, imagine saying that to the poor woman. I mean, geez, was I a prize? And so that must have been quite awful for me, because all along, I mean, not to say anything about how awful it was for her.
Well, why was it awful for you? You were what? You were 5, 6?
Well,
at that time?
Well, to be told I'm Jewish, when all my life I had heard these terrible stories in church. You know, they weren't saying, let's pray for the Jews, they should convert, and the Nazis should let them go. There was nothing like that. They were the priests, you know. They were telling the people in church that the Jews were the enemies, and I was singing hallelujah. I was doing whatever my mother was doing. We didn't walk out. So imagine all of a sudden now you're one of the people who causes starvation and unemployment and etc. Not unlike today.
And you remember feeling, like you remember her feelings when she told you?
Yes, yes, yes.
So how did you deal with that, a little girl of 5, 6?
I don't remember the rest. It's just that. How I dealt with, this is one of the things that imprinted on me, that you have to keep certain things quiet. You don't talk about where you were born. You don't tell anybody that your age, because then they'll connect one and one, and you're going to have to talk about that terrible time in your family's life. And that's not a good thing. So I never talked about it.
So even after the war,
Absolute.
you would not.
I'm referring to that, yeah. None of my friends know my story. One of my friends, but even with her, it was very gingerly.
And so when you went to school here and people would ask about you, what would you say?
No, people didn't ask. The kids, you know, in public school, no, I was just a weird child. I didn't speak English. I was tall. I was well endowed at a young age. I was just the immigrant. Yeah, not unlike today. I was the other, and Jews were not friendly towards Jews. Some were, because there was a woman who adopted us. Yes, absolutely. She's very important. Mrs. Bronson is very important to mention.
Do you have any memories of the DP camp, like your living circumstances, your accommodation?
They were bunkers. I remember that. Like bunkers.
You mean bunk?
Like camp cabins made of wood.
How many families in one?
You know what? I don't remember it being crowded.
But it wasn't just your family. There were others.
I don't know. It wasn't this was an issue for me. My mother was very nice to us, except when she left me to have that little golden kid. That wasn't very nice.
But that was not in the DP camp. You arrived in the DP camp with him.
Yeah. But that had a profound effect on me. Profound.
In what ways?
And that I only found out about the effect it had on me was when I was in psychoanalysis on the couch. At some point, I was abandoned, and I had a lot of trust issues as a result. I had a lot of trust issues. I had a lot of, not attachment issues, but I couldn't bear the pain of losing someone. It was awful for me. It was as if I became, not psychotic in the sense of detached from reality when someone left, when someone died. Like an important person, not, the king died. Yeah.
Any other memories of your circumstances in the DP camp? Where did you eat? What kind of beds did you have? What
No,
did you eat?
I don't remember.
And who looked after you in the DP camp?
My mother?
So she didn't work?
No.
How about your father? Did he do anything?
I think he was something, and I think it was to do with accounting. I think he was like the treasurer or something. I don't know.
What food memories do you have of the DP camp?
Food?
Yeah, apart from the orange peel.
Yeah. I don't have any. It's not like I was starving or anything. Well, I never would be. I had a mother who was never hungry. There was one piece of bread, you take it. Well, aren't you hungry? No, I'm not hungry. So I can't imagine ever having an issue with food.
Any memories of other children?
No.
That you would play with?
No. Nowhere. That's why I'm saying no. It's a good question. No. I don't see any children. Wait a second. There was a little boy, and eventually we met up here, Citronbaum, and he of course didn't remember me. Not of course, he didn't remember me. That's a crock. If I remembered him, he remembered me. And we played together, and I remember being in the woods with him, and I had to go to the bathroom, and I used a leaf. I remember that, a bit sexual. But not in front of him, but still and all. I mean, the whole thing is quite... and he, well, when we met afterwards, I said, you and I know you. We were friends. He must have been in the DP camp. He wasn't much older than I, and he denied it. How can you know? Well, who am I to challenge whether he remembered?
But when did you leave the DP camp to come to Canada?
We must have left in 48, because that's...
arrived,
yeah.
When?
We arrived in 48 in November, I think, or
October,
yeah.
Before we come to...
Because I remember the ship.
Oh, yeah?
Not the ship, the people, what happened on the ship. So we'll talk about that later?
Yeah, so
Okay.
Just before we get on that ship, I just want to go back a little bit and I'd
Please.
like you to talk about how the war, you think, affected you, what your parents went through it, and what you, even if you don't remember the exact events you went through it, but how did that affect you?
Well, we were always hidden from the point of view of we didn't talk about this. The community that my mother, she wasn't friends with these people where she, when she was a little girl, because there's, it's like everything else, there's class, right? And she was really, anyway. But after the war, when they met up, they had meetings. I don't remember how often, but they ostracized my family because we were fortunate. We weren't in a camp like they were. There's a gradation of suffering. So if you lose one parent, you suffer less than the person who loses both parents, which is nonsense, but that's the way it was. And my parents accepted this definition. So they weren't really made to feel welcome. So the friends they made, and because the two of them were so close together, they knew each other as children, really. I mean, they were young when they met. My mother was very dependent on my father emotionally. And I'm sure he was dependent on her because, it's a dance that couples do after 2 or 3 years. One's a good guy, one's a bad guy, but really get rid of the good guy and, that's the marriage dance. But having said that, my father and mother went everywhere together. And that was in part to having lived as aliens, they had secrets. They had to keep everything, press their cards, as you say. It was how they dealt with it is my mother was very, very, very busy. There wasn't a minute that she would sit and do anything, but she did listen to the radio a lot. That's how she learned her English. But even then, she was doing something. My father dealt with it intellectually, but always in a positive manner. My mother was, a lot of her religion, the prophets and all, affected her. So she would come up with these fabulous comments about things. The world is good, it's the people that aren't good. I understand that I can accept that you had to kill the adults, but why the children? What did they do wrong? My mother witnessed when the Nazis, so this was in Warsaw, outside of Warsaw, there was a garden and the Nazis lured the Jewish little kids with cyanide-filled candy. So she witnessed that. My father didn't talk about these things. He must have witnessed some pretty horrible things as well. So that's how they acclimatized. My father never went back to medical school. Again, this wonderful family of my mother's, her cousin, that would be a first cousin, Henry Kravitz, was a renowned psychiatrist. Never once did my father had asked his sister, could you ask Henry if he could tell me where to go, introduce me, etc. Never once did he agree. Of course, he didn't do it for his nephew. Why would he do it for this guy, It was a pretty awful family. It is a pretty awful family, but I believe in karma, so there we go. So what he did was, when they first came, my mother, who was very, very, very bright, got a job. And it's interesting, nothing was beneath her. They had to work, because that's what you had to do to feed your family. There was no such a thing as going to JIAS, or I don't even think we knew about it. I only know it because I headed a committee, but they never knew about it then. Although once we went for clothes, Pesach clothes, and I got this lovely, anyway, that's it. And,
tell me about that.
Yeah, I remember I got this really lovely fur hat, like tied here, like a Russian, and a gorgeous beige camel coat. It was brand new stuff. I don't know what my brother got. He must have gotten something as well. But other than that, we never went anywhere for anything. So my mother got a job in a bakery, and she had to apprentice 2 weeks to tie a box, a cake box. Those days, there was no toilet paper, there was no air conditioning, these places were very, very hot, etc. But she did it. So this is a woman who had maids doing those things for her, and now she never complained about it, ever, ever.
Did they manage to salvage some of their money after the war?
No.
So they had to use it all up hiding?
Yeah, thank God they had it. And my father, so that's what she did. She worked in a bakery forever. And so my father worked in the daytime, and my mother worked at night. And my mother, as I said, she kept her depression down by being busy. So there was no such a thing as not having a 5-course meal. Lousy cooking, but we didn't know it was lousy. Anyway, my father got a job sweeping fur in a factory. He was grateful to have the job. And then he started to go to school at night to Sir George Williams, and he got a degree in accounting, and he worked as an accountant. Wasn't his first love, but...
Because now we got to Canada, tell me your memories of the boat. You said that you had some memories of the boat and the people.
Well, yeah, that was interesting. So we went on the boat, and on the boat we were downstairs. It's wherever you call it, at the bottom. When you see pictures of the slave boats, the slaves are down in the bottom. That's where we were. We were cramped. People were sick all over the place. I mean, vomiting, etc. Also other sicknesses. And we had a funeral. I remember that. That was pretty awful. That was memorable. So it must have been traumatic for me. Because what do you do when a person dies on a ship? It wasn't a boat, it was a ship. You throw them in the water.
Who were the other passengers down there in the steerage?
I don't know any of them. There were men, women.
Refugees?
Yes. We were all refugees. Yes.
Refugees?
Pardon me?
Jewish refugees?
I don't know. I presume. I mean, who else would be dare to come with a bunch of Jews. I mean, after all, we were vermin. I would imagine they were. Yeah, I would imagine they were. Yeah, I would imagine they were.
Did you ever go up from the steerage?
Yes, we could go, but that's where we lived, and it wasn't segregated. Families lived together, one on top of the other, not on top, beside.
No cabins or anything like that?
No. It was like a football field, which is fine. I mean, that is not a complaint I would have even today.
Do you remember what you, little girl, brought with you?
Pardon me?
Do you remember what you brought with you? Did you have any toys, a doll or anything?
No. Interesting you should say that, because when we came to Canada, the government gave money. I don't remember how much. And what do you think my father bought? Me a doll, a beautiful doll. And he got it from my mother. But that was who my father was. Not that she was any worse. She also, Roma Sholas cult. She suffers from the winter. Get her a mink coat. Not that they were in that financial, situation, but so the doll, using that money for the doll was,
What other memories do you have of the crossing?
For some reason, I see my mother smiling and she's talking to someone, a lady. And I think it was someone from her town, because they were kind of hugging. Yeah.
Did your family make friends with any other families or any other adults?
No.
On that trip?
Not at all. No.
What memories do you have of arriving in Halifax?
I don't have any, neither positive nor negative. But I remember the train. That was fun. But when I say fun, but these weren't joyful moments. None of this was joyful. None of it. There was nothing joyful about my experiences.
You mentioned that the reason why you came to Canada was because there was this relative who
Yes,
supported you.
yes. My father put our name on many lists. He really didn't care where we would go, as long as Israel was one of them. And because I'm thinking of the guy from my mother's shtetl. So he didn't care, but this came up first. So we came. My father loved Canada. He has a flag on his grave, and I'm in charge of changing it because it has to be perfect, which is correct. It's an honor. And we found letters that he wrote to the prime ministers, different prime ministers, giving his suggestions. I mean, he took life very seriously. He was so grateful to Canada, loved Canada, wore his little flag in his lapel, loved it. The best country in the world. The United States was the second, but he loved Canada.
When you arrived, you stayed at this relative who I think lived on Esplanade, because you mentioned it was Fletcher's Field, and you also mentioned a little story about a potato and lighting candle.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that these charming relatives did Friday night was they were very kind. As they were lighting their silver candlesticks, they cut a potato in half, made a hole, and gave it to my mother so she could light candles too. She stuck the candles in there.
Once you moved out, did you keep in touch? Did your parents keep in touch with them?
Pardon me?
Once you moved out, when you went to Mayor's, did they keep in touch?
Well, they
with
didn't
them?
want to keep in touch with us. They could have invited us for Shabbat or something. We were the poor relatives. But remember, I said I believe in karma. We were at a wedding, and the table next to us was their children and the other children. So someone said, "That's your cousin Mirla and Kalman." And the kid said, "Oh, I didn't know." And he came to sit with us. And he said, "How come I never knew about you?" I said, you'd have to ask your father and mother. And we talked, and I said, it's too bad you didn't know about us. We're really quite famous. You could look, it was before the internet, you could ask about us. Right now, my brother's a judge, but who knows where he's going to do. I'm in charge of the ER, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I want to be in touch with you. I said, lovely. Never heard from him, which is in part my fault. I should have asked him for it, because he was a kid. I should have asked him for his phone, coordinates or something, and really pursued it.
You mentioned that you moved to Mayor Street and then you moved on, but you mentioned
yes,
there were
Mrs. Bronson.
People there that were important to you.
Yes. So I don't know how my mother met. She must have met her in the bakery, Mrs. Bronson. Mrs. Bronson was a short, plump, an image of Mrs. Santa Claus woman. And she was involved with some organization, I don't know which one. And she was very, very, very kind. And when she heard where we were living, oy, oy, oy. So she asked her friend, Mrs. Marin, if she has an availability in one of her buildings on Esplanade. Now it's called Esplanade, and it's quite regentrified, but back then. And so Mrs. Marin said yes. And Mrs. Bronson paid the month's rent. Mrs. Bronson was not a rich woman. She was a dressmaker. And we moved into this wonderful, wonderful place on Esplanade. Mrs. Bronson was really the closest thing that I could think of in my remembrance, in my memory of a grandmother. She was lovely. My brother used to play sports, and he had a lot of friends, and he'd always rip something, but he was afraid that, I don't know what he was afraid of, that his mom would really, my mother, would give him the what for, and so he'd run to Mrs. Bronson, and she'd fix it up. As for me, the princessa, I wanted clothes, as my mother would say, was Homenot in the Schweiz getracht, but whatever, if you know the story of Purim. So I had designer clothes that she made for me. She was lovely. I still see her as I talk to you. So unfortunately, her daughter, she had one daughter, was not enamored with my mother, and I don't blame her. Apart from that, physically, that my mother was so beautiful in comparison to Evelyn. But I think more than that, it was that her mother paid more attention to my mother, because her mother was on a mission. And really, what's the expression? Charity begins at home. She should have been kinder to her daughter.
Was she also an immigrant herself?
No. Well, if she was, she would have, I don't know that part, but she didn't have an accent. I know that. And both my brother and I remember her. Yeah. One of the really nice memories that I have living on Mayor Street. Was it Mayor Street? Yeah, it was Mayor Street. Yeah, in the semi-slums. There was a garage there, and they sold to Petro, but one of the mechanics, I think he was the owner, took a liking to my brother, and my brother was still in diapers, so he must have been, 3, and he would follow him around, maybe younger too. And his name was Slim. I didn't remember the other name. His name was Slim. And Slim was not Jewish. We were Jewish. We were immigrants. I just remember him as Anglophone, but my brother thinks he may have been Francophone. And he was wonderful to my brother. and I'm thinking of another memory, sorry. And Morty, my brother, tried to find him when he became an adult, and we weren't successful. He wasn't successful, which is too bad. People are really kind. Not everybody, but. So we used to live on Mayor Street and Park Avenue. Park Avenue and St. Catherine Street, which wasn't far from where we lived, was Steinberg's. Steinberg's is a grocery store. My brother and I had a little ritual. The ritual was the following. Now, I was quite a lot taller than he at that point, and we were obvious. There's no way that the staff there didn't know. Steinberg's is a grocery store. They have everything. Once a week, could have been more, but I'm being nice to myself and my brother. We went in, and at the entrance to Steinberg's was a section where you have gum, chiclets, little squares of gum in a box. And I would pick up a box, and as we went through to the exit, we would finish the box of chiclets, and we left. Now, I find it hard to believe that no one noticed this. Every week we did this. So they're kind people, you know? I mean, they could have said, but they didn't.
Who looked after you? I mean, when you arrived here, you were 4, your brother was, you were 7, 8, your brother was 3, 4. Who took care of you?
Well, my mother worked at night, my father worked at the daytime. So when my father was off, my mother was on. But I remember times where I was taking care of my brother, often. In fact, he still has a part of a lead pencil in his bum from one of the dogs.
Did you go to school?
Yes,
right
yes,
away
yes, right away. Oh, that was very important in my house, my mother's house, as it is in mine. That above all, you had a job. The only job you had was school. So we were enlisted. I fell asleep half the time. I didn't speak English. I didn't know what they were talking about. But everyone was very kind to me. Like, no one yelled at me or yelled at my mother or anything.
What school did you go to?
At that point, I don't know the name of the street because that was in the slum street. But later on, when we moved to Esplanade, I went to Edward VII, and then I went to Baron Byng.
What are your memories of the elementary school when you went to Edward VII? Did you already speak English?
I think so, yes. I don't know how good, but clearly I was different.
In what sense? How?
I had very curly hair until I realized I could iron it. That was not the thing to be. You didn't want to look Jewish. I was tall. I was endowed at a young age. This is primary school. I was different. Everything about me was different.
What else was different? Were your clothes different?
They were, but very high fashion. You know, so I had like the thing that was in style was a felt skirt, felt skirts and nylon blouses. I had a felt skirt and nylon blouses. I had, I've always been that way. My mother had wonderful taste, although she was toned down, but she still had fabulous things. Not many, but one day I had my new shoes, and I was a little kid, so I would have been in maybe grade 6, and I wore my new shoes, and they were wedgies. Like, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to like wedgies, and I wore them to school, and it started to snow, and everybody got so excited, and I took my shoe to my face, and I said, oh, my poor shoe, it's going to get wet, or something, whatever kids do. And the teacher, I'll never forget her, Dermer was her name. And again, Karma, I'll tell you about that. And she said, stop kissing your shoes. Like, why would you even pay attention to a kid? You know, what's your problem? I met her years later at a friend's house. My friend, for some reason, was having a big party for women. And she's sitting around in a little circle telling everyone what a wonderful teacher she was and how she was loved. And I said to her, you're Mrs. Dermer. She said, yes. Do I know you? I said, well, I was in your class. You know, in those days, I don't know if you know this, in those days, you became a teacher, I think a 2-year program out of high school. So she wasn't much older than I. I said, and I said something along the lines of, that's not my recollection of you at all. You know, at that point, I had become accomplished. I had my master's. I was head of this. And so I felt very comfortable. That's not my, you know, anyway. She didn't have problems with the imposter syndrome.
How was your relationship with your classmates? First of all, who were your classmates? Were they Jewish? Were they immigrants?
We were all Jewish. That was a Jewish area. I don't remember anyone else being an immigrant. I was the only, and I was what's the word? I can't remember. Exiled.
Ostracized.
Thank you. Yes, ostracized. Not by the kids, but when I would go to the house, it was clear I wasn't welcome. And later on, it rubbed off on the kids. I did have some friends, but I knew I was an outsider, and it hurt me. So I wasn't part of the club, so I started my own little club. It was a very sad time.
Who became part of your little club?
I had 2 friends, Florence Nierenberg, and I don't remember the other person.
And they were Canadian Jews?
Yes, yes. Her father was a big intellect, so I think, you know, I don't think that was the atmosphere in the house to ostracize anyone, you know, or not like a person because they were whatever.
In general, you and recently immigrant family, what was, you know, not the reaction, the treatments? What kind of treatment did you and your family get from Canadian Jews or Jews who came much earlier, you know, before the war? What incidents, or do you remember?
Well, they weren't helpful. Like, no one reached out to give my father a proper job. They weren't helpful to my mother. I mean, how many Jewish women worked in a bakery? You know, I mean, no one asked us anything about that except for Mrs. Bronson. I don't know if it was my parents doing, because they were hidden. They continued to be hidden, like they didn't go to synagogue except on holy days. They didn't join anything. My father loved chess, so he went to a chess clubs. But no one reached out to us except for Mrs. Bronson.
But your parents did join the Landsmannschaft.
Yes, but they weren't really welcome there because, you know, they had a good time during the war.
So who became your parents' friends?
They didn't have, I wouldn't say they had friends. Well, they had one friend, Mrs. Ackerman, but it's funny, she wasn't from the Luntz thing, but yet she was more accepted there than my parents were. Yeah.
How about neighbors? You lived in a very Jewish area. Were there neighbors that were friendly with your family?
Well, we were friendly, but we weren't friends. Like, I don't remember anyone inviting us for Shabbat or for Pesach or whatever.
And when you went to Barenbink High School,
I had friends.
Is a very Jewish high school?
Yes, absolutely.
So what was your experience there in that school?
I had friends. I had anti-Semitic teachers.
Tell me about that.
Mrs. Ryan, again, I could tell you a karma story. Mrs. Ryan, I had a learning problem, which no one knew about. Because my parents would be the first to send me off somewhere. Because I know my brother didn't speak. My brother, the big speaker now, didn't speak till he was about 3 years old, and they had already sent him to speech therapy, etc. So it wasn't, they would have sent me anywhere, but we didn't know about these things. So that coupled with depression, I remember, in retrospect, I learned that I was, I knew my symptoms, but I forgot your question, I'm sorry.
Your experience in Barrington High School, as
Yes.
opposed to the experience you
Yes.
had in elementary school.
So academically, I did not do well. And it's interesting because one of my best friends was Carol Kuzmarov. Carol Kuzmarov sat in seat 6, row 6. I sat in seat 6, row 1. She was the best student, and I was the worst student. Well, I don't know about the worst, but I would imagine I was pretty down there. So I did have friends, and I did have friends because they came over, maybe I remember parties and blah, blah, blah. But it was more because of my chirpy personality than my intellect or, anything like that, or my looks. I was very foreign looking. I had curly hair.
Other Jewish kids in the class did not have curly hair?
They were ironing their hair. No, it wasn't a thing to have. It was very Jewish. Don't forget I'm 82.
Yeah, but I would think in a Jewish area,
No.
you're allowed to look Jewish.
No, this is after the war. Being Jewish was not a good thing. Not that we hid it. We all were Jewish. We all went to shul, on Yontif. But no.
So the girls you were friends with, who were these girls? What was their backgrounds?
They were all Canadian. There was no one that had, not that I chose them, but there weren't any other immigrants in my school.
There were, maybe not in your class, but there
Yeah.
were a lot of immigrants in Barrington.
At Edward VII?
No, I'm talking about Barrington.
Oh, Barrenbing? No, there weren't any in my class.
Because I know many other.
Yeah, no, I believe you. I'm not challenging you at all. It's interesting, for a kid who had learning difficulties, I took Latin, because you had to be Latin, science, whatever. Anyway, so yeah, I didn't have a great time in high school. But I had friends, and I was a leader because of who I was. Like as a person, I'm chirpy. And then I realized I was depressed, so I allowed myself to be depressed, and people couldn't take that. As an adult, they said, "What's wrong with you?" I have no right.
I know what we were talking about earlier.
Okay, great.
Ryan, the teacher, the anti-Semitic teacher.
Oh, Miss Ryan.
So why was she anti-Semitic? In what way was she anti-Semitic?
Well, she would put me down. She'd say, "Empty vessels make the loudest noise." Like, she was nasty to me. She didn't have to be, because I wasn't a nasty kid. I wasn't rude. I wasn't rough. I just knew she was anti-Semitic. Maybe it was paranoia, but I knew she was. One day, I meet Miss Ryan, holier than thou, at Ogilvy's. And there I am wearing a fabulous new mink coat that I bought, or someone bought. And we're in the elevator. They used to have people opening the doors with white gloves. It was a gentler time. And I said, "Hi, Miss Ryan, you probably don't remember me." And she looked at me, very wasp. And so that's not a put down name. That's a real sociological word, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, for the audience. And I said, you probably don't remember me, but you may remember Carol Kuzmarov. "Oh, Carol Kuzmarov, how is she?" I said, "Exactly." So I was her friend, Roma Mintz. She still didn't remember me. And I just wanted to update you on my life. You once told me that I would not amount to anything. So let me tell you how life has turned out so far. I'm a graduate, a master's degree from McGill. I'm blah, blah. I told her everything. And then I said, oh, excuse me, it's my floor. Ta-ta. Karma. You just have to live long enough.
Did you have Jewish teachers as well in Barranquilla?
Yes, Miss Katz, the opposite. The opposite. She knew I was an immigrant, and she was ever so kind. I had many kind teachers. She really looked out for me.
In what way did your kind teacher look out for you, her and other teachers?
They gave you a smile. They asked you how you were, and which they didn't do to everyone. Also, it was the day of milk money, where you got milk if you couldn't afford it. I got milk. So, they were just, the way they did things was very kind. And I'm sure there were some non-Jewish teachers who were also very kind. But these three teachers really were remarkable in, 2 negative and 1 positive. Not bad statistic.
When you said that you had friends, you had a better time in Barranquilla than you had in Edward VII.
Yes.
You had friends. What would friendship involve? Would you go to each other's house?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
And we would do things, and we would laugh. We would talk about, gossip about the teachers, la-da-da.
How would you be accepted or welcomed by the parents?
The parents weren't in the picture. I think they were all working. So maybe that was the common denominator. Rather than being immigrant, it was the status, the class.
And you would also invite them over
Absolutely.
to your house. So there was no...
I had a very nice house.
Tell me about the house. That's the house on Esplanade.
Yes, it was very nice.
Tell me about that.
So the entrance, I wouldn't do it that way myself now. The entrance was a huge room, and we had a lovely Persian carpet, and my brother and I used to play marbles during Pesach with nuts, because it had a square. We also played it outside. And then we had immediately to the right was a bedroom with a balcony, and then to the right was it was called a double parlor. And my parents used that. And then there was another bedroom opposite the dining room, and they rented that out. And there was 1 bathroom, and we had a dining room, also very nice furniture. And then we had a sit-in kitchen, and we always had a radio. We always had some kind of books around, magazines, of course. And we had a shed, and we had a kitten, Minnie, because you have rats, you have to have kittens.
Who was the tenant? Was it someone changing all the time, or did you have a long-time tenant?
No. They were people who came, immigrants who came, who needed a place, and then, they got whatever, and yeah, there was changes. But at one point, my parents stopped that.
And did you rent it furnished, or that was your parents'
No,
furniture?
that was my parents' furniture. You should have seen the living room. Oh, wow.
So from those 2 jobs, they
Yes.
kind of managed to...
Oh, yeah, and they paid cash for everything. Yeah. Well, it was a different life then, eh? You didn't go dining and wining, and you didn't go to movies. It's certainly not. We didn't. Yeah.
Did you go on holiday with them?
Yes, we did. We used to go to Maine and up north. I mean, they couldn't have had much time off, but yes. And my father would take us, my mother would be working on the weekend, my father would take us to Kingston to see the armory. I mean, yeah, we did. And we always went to the mountain. Every week we went to the mountains. And there were a lot of immigrants there. And we had picnics there. And so I have very fond memories of that.
Picnics with whom? With other people?
No.
Just few
No.
of you.
Yeah, no.
How about belonging to the Jewish Public Library or the YMWH?
My father did. He went to the YMHA with my brother. No, we didn't go to the Jewish Public Library. No. I mean, we may have gone, but no. The Y, we did.
You
There were.
said that-
I belonged to a club there. Yeah,
What club?
must have clubs for kids, you know.
You said that your parents kind of hid always, told you to hide. And that they didn't belong to synagogue, they only went on high holidays. So how do you see how much you have integrated into Jews here, in the Jewish society here?
How did I integrate?
And your family, yeah, and your parents.
Well, we never forgot that we were Jewish. We were very Jewish. We weren't Orthodox. There were mezuzahs. We had Hanukkah. We celebrated holidays.
Seder?
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My father would do it to the end. I wasn't there to the end, but when my daughter, she and he would do it to the end. Yeah. No. Those were things that were important. And we all went to synagogue on the high holidays.
Which synagogue did you go to?
When we lived on Esplanade, we went. There's a synagogue on, the first street west of Park Avenue is. Is it? I don't think it's Jean Mance, but there was a. It's now a Stiebel.
It is your man.
Okay, so we went there, and then afterwards we became members of different synagogues.
So you did become members.
Yes.
Did your brother have a bar mitzvah?
Oh gosh, yes.
Jim Mance?
Big. No, he had it on Fairmount because that was the big synagogue. It was a beautiful synagogue. Oh yeah, it was a big deal. We had a live orchestra. Oh my goodness.
How long did you live on Esplanade? Or when did you move around?
I would imagine that we lived there about, till the end of high school, because then my parents bought a home in NDG.
And what did you do after high school?
I went to university.
And you studied? What did you study?
Just a general BA, major in psych and a minor in SOS. What does someone who needs therapy study?
And then what?
And then I went on for a master's in social work.
And then you moved to New York, right?
Yeah, because Jewish girls didn't move out of the house in the city in those days. And all my friends were in Manhattan. So I was there until I met my husband and I left.
So tell me about your husband. Where did you meet him?
I met him at a party in Manhattan. He was doing postdoc studies at Columbia, and I was working. I guess in reality, I was just looking to get married. I mean, I never thought about it that way. I mean, I never has. That wasn't my ambition. I went into social work because I was depressed. Years later, I figured it out. Because really, there's nothing about me that likes to do traditional and I never had to, thank God. I like the part of doing therapy where it's a puzzle. And my father always said I should be a lawyer. And of course, if my father said at a certain point, because he disappointed me, from that point on, if he said black, I said white. If I said white, he said black.
Why did your father disappoint you?
Well, because all my life I was taught that people are equal and that you have to believe in the best in people, etc. When I went to university, I was a macher, and I was on the student council, and one of my friends was Taylor. I think that was his family name. Really nice man. Well, I wouldn't have called him a man at that time. And he was black. And my father knew about him because I talked about him. I talked about everyone. And I said, Taylor asked me out. He said, well, you just can't go. I said, why can't I go? He says, because that's not what you can do. You can't go out with black people. You can't go out with Christian people. That was the only two options in those days. Mind you, we didn't have many black people back then in Montreal. And I said, well, I don't understand. You said we were all equal. How come, all of a sudden he's not equal to me? He said, that's not the reality of life. I said, well, why didn't you tell me that before? So after that, when you're placed too high by anyone, you're going to fall. That's a fact of life. Whenever a patient of mine would say, oh, you're so wonderful, I couldn't live without you, I always say to them, uh-oh, I am going to fall. That's what happened to my father. So we had a contentious relationship in terms of, and he was right. I should have become a lawyer because that's really, I'm very good at that. But I loved my career. Loved my career.
Was it important for you to be with, to have a Jewish boyfriend or a Jewish husband?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't see Taylor. That's not his first name. That was his family name. I didn't see him as a marriage material. He was a friend. I wasn't attracted to him. I doubt he was attracted to me. He's nice looking, but but those weren't my values. My values were my parents' values. And they didn't believe in marrying outside of your faith or color or whatever, because it's hard enough to be married, let alone, and in those days, it's not like today. Today is great. You walk down the street, you see, couples. Don't forget, was it just in 1968 that you were allowed to intermarry? That was part of, and I was privileged. I was white. It was he didn't want me to suffer. He figured I suffered enough, but he didn't bring me up that way, you see. So I was very, very disappointed. But luckily, karma, before he died, my parents used to go to Palm Springs, and my brother would go sometimes. Did I tell you this story already? Sometimes, and I would go sometimes during the winter. And it was my turn to go, and also it was convenient in terms of what I did as a living. And so I went down, and my father always had to take me to some famous place, the famous place where this one was Cher and whatever his name is, Cher's husband at the time. He had a restaurant. And so we went there, we walked over, and when we came back, my father was shoveling his feet. And I said, Daddy, you're schlepping your feet. He says, yeah, I'm the schlepper. And we laughed. But luckily, 2 years before that, or 3 years before that, I said to myself, how long is this going to go on, Roma? And I decided that, and I figured out a method. My method was this. I said, Daddy, I'm going to say something. I'm going to ask you something, but don't answer me. Think about it and then get back to me. So that's how I worked it, thank God, because when he died, so the next morning he woke up and he was yelling, and I thought, oh, fuck. I didn't say fuck in those days, but whatever I said, they're fighting. And in fact, they weren't. He had collapsed. So I was very grateful that he and I had a rapprochement.
We kind of
yes.
off from your husband, and so you met your husband in New York.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about him. What was his name, first of all?
His name was Yaakov, and I say was because he died of a terrible death, Lou Gehrig's disease. His name was Yaakov Moshe Shuker. He was an Iraqi Jew, and I didn't know what Iraqi Jews were. To me, you're a Jew, you're a Jew. And certainly to my parents, they didn't know the difference. And he was studying there, and I met him at a party, and we were leaving, my friend and I were leaving, and he was coming in, and he says, "You're leaving already?" And he was quite the little flirt, which I didn't mind, and the rest was history.
So where did you get married?
We got married in Israel because we don't have a family, and my parents wanted to honor his parents because they have a huge family. So
all in Israel.
Yeah.
And you lived in Israel also.
I did off and on for about 5 years.
You had your children there.
I did.
So where were they born and when?
Both of them were born in Israel. One was born in 71, and the other one was born in 73.
What's their names?
My son's name is, again, that's an interesting story. My daughter was born first. Her name is Yael. Yael from Medina, after my maternal grandmother, Shuker, Arnold. And my son's name is, he was born Moshe Benjamin, after my grandfather, Shuker. But I think we legally changed it. It's Jason Shuker. So the reason he is Jason Shuker, we lived in the town of Mount Royal, which is a predominantly Christian area, certainly when we lived there. And the kids used to go off to the park, gentler times. And one day they came back and they hopped onto the stools and they said, "We want to change our names." I said, "Sure. What do you want to be called?" And my son said Jason, although he tells me it was Jonathan. Jason, and my daughter said Jennifer. I said, "Great names you picked." And I wrote letters to the school, and Jason's friends went from kindergarten to first grade, and they didn't remember that his name was Moshe, and so it wasn't a problem. My daughter had been with these kids for quite a long time, and so when the teacher called out Jennifer, they all laughed. "That's not Jennifer, that's Yael." So Yael.
Did they go to Jewish school?
They certainly did. I'm very Jewish. Friday night was Friday night. My mother's and father's, and then when my mother put salt in the Polish gefilte fish, it was time for me to take over, because it doesn't go with salt, it goes with sugar. Anyway, and then it was at my house, and yeah.
Just one question, kind of going back
No
to
problem.
the beginning of your time here is, what was the most difficult thing about settling here in Montreal for you at the beginning? What were the difficulties for you?
Well, I don't have any feelings attached to it, so it's not like there was something terrible, but I'm sure if I thought about it, one, being different. I was different in many ways right from the beginning. I was different from not speaking the language. I was bigger than the kids my age. My parents had accents, and typically of children, no matter where they come from, speak English. Don't talk to me in that. Wah, wah, wah. And we were poor. We were always poor. Yeah. There was a difference, yeah. I felt the difference.
Now, I'm going to jump back to your children. You said that you grew up in a family where you didn't really ask questions because you kind of sensed that you don't ask questions. What did you transmit to your children? How did that change in your family? Talking about your parents, the war.
It's interesting because in my parents' home, we talked about everything, but not that. You know, we talked very openly about sex, about finances, but certainly not about that. In my home, yes, we talked about everything. Nothing was off the. And my grandchildren would interview me for for the Holocaust and etc.
And your children, would you talk about the war with your children, with Yael and your son?
Well, they knew that I was born during the war. When it, if it was appropriate, no,
I'm trying to gauge
Yeah.
to what extent you kind of transmitted this. This is not something we talk about, that you imbibed as a child onto your children.
That's interesting. I never asked them that. It wasn't prominent in the house, although I did go to the memorials, and I would ask them along. They went to Jewish schools, and that was very prominent there. They didn't volunteer me to speak to anyone. They volunteered me for everyone else, but they never volunteered me for that. No, we didn't talk about it, and I would imagine that that the reason we didn't is because I transmitted that to them. They didn't sit around asking my parents about the war. No.
Because that would have been a generation that
Yeah.
would have asked, yeah.
No, they did not. They knew. I mean, we didn't have any family, right? They didn't have a great grandfather. I never had a grandfather. I never had an aunt. I never had a cousin. I never had any of these things, and everybody else did.
If you think about the way you raised them, the fact that you were born during the war, that you were in hiding, your parents' trauma and all that, how do you think that influenced the way you raised your children? Or in what points can you see, oh yeah, this happened, this I did because of my experience?
Well, I certainly didn't try to keep being Jewish a secret. We were very Jewish.
I'm not even talking about in terms of Judaism, but let's say where you're an anxious parent, where you're someone who wouldn't let them do certain things,
No.
That kind of thing.
No, I wasn't anxious. I wasn't fearful. I raised my children keeping up with the Joneses. So they went to private schools, Jewish schools. I couldn't afford that, but I sent them. I never bought a house. Everybody else had houses. I rented. My priorities were different. They went to fancy Jewish camps. One went to the States. The other one went to a fancy camp in Algonquin Park. Don't remember the question.
No. Question is how how it influenced your upbringing, your bringing up your children.
I wasn't an anxious parent. No, I wasn't anxious. My house was always open to everyone. When my daughter became religious, I wasn't Shomer Shabbos, that's for sure not. She could be if she wants to be. But everything was glut kosher because she had friends who came from a glut kosher home, and there was no way that I was going to put that on my conscience, I think I transmitted to them that they had to be married to. We talked about that actually, my kids and I, that they needed to marry within their faith.
And they did.
One did and one didn't. And the reason I gave them is that we have an obligation to our history. And so my son married a religious Catholic who did not stop practicing Catholicism, did not convert, which is fine with me. I don't believe in conversions. I don't believe in them because what am I going to say? Don't go visit your Goyish grandparents. They're very nice. Actually, they're lovely. So that wasn't, that's why I don't believe in conversion. The lineage, and you don't feel the same thing. You know, you don't. It's not in your DNA, as my friend and I agreed. A Jew, a real Jew, has a bag packed all the time. Ready to go. So he married this young woman, a fellow student, and she's absolutely. She told me, I never asked her. She told me in front of my brother and sister-in-law that she's not converting, and however that she promises. I never asked her to promise that she will keep that her children, their children will be raised Jewish. My son wasn't there; we were waiting for him, and that she was keep. She would. They would be raised Jewish, and it would be a Jewish home, and she has kept that. All right, so she doesn't have 2 dishes anymore because they moved into a bigger house, but there wasn't room for 2 sets of dishes. She said, I hope you don't mind. Well, it's not my business, it's your home.
How about your daughter?
But by the way, she always has a drawer where there's kosher food for me because I don't eat non-kosher, certainly not cheese, you know. My daughter is kosher. She used to be more religious. But she's kosher. Her kids did not. They went partly to a Jewish school only because in Hamilton there's not much of a choice, and the school really was a terrible fit. She married a Jewish boy, and he's absolutely lovely. I'm very lucky. Everyone has their piece of luck is another one of my things besides karma. And I'm very lucky when it comes to kids and grandkids and parking, which is very important, parking spots.
But it seems to me that what your parents and you didn't have in terms of, you know, being embedded in the Jewish community of this town, you try to give that to your children.
Yes, in fact, I worked at the Montreal General. Specifically, I did not want to be at the Jewish General.
Because?
I just didn't want to be involved with Jews. I mean, I didn't want to have to think about where I came from. I didn't want to have to think about it. I didn't want to, whereas in a non-Jewish community, believe me, the last thing they're talking about is the Holocaust.
So basically the hiding for you was the hiding of your history.
That is my theme, one of an important theme in my life. And manned my life is the whole notion of hiding, being careful who you divulge things to, not things, about your experiences, because they're so painful to resurrect.
So how did you come out of the cupboard, so to speak?
I haven't. I still haven't told people. I'm telling you, which was a big thing, because you and I connected a while ago, and it was a big thing. And the reason I did it is because I guess it's not close enough, it's distant enough, so that I'm not emotional about it. You know, I can talk, but I notice that as I'm talking, when you ask me questions, I'm censoring. There's memories that come up that I'm not divulging. Not important, but you know, they're important for me to divulge. You know, when I used to go to these memorials, annual things, I never stood up. They said, who are the pleas for the Holocaust survivors? I never, ever stood up.
Do you feel differently about this now?
No, I'm not ready to tell the world anything. The world doesn't have to know. I'm not important enough, and doesn't make a difference.
Why did you accept at this point in your life to do an interview like this that identifies you as a Holocaust survivor?
Because my son-in-law has been bugging me a lot about telling my story. And he's in the process. By the way, my son-in-law is a world-renowned, what's it called? World-renowned blood disease doctor. Not vascular, that's my niece. I forget what it's called. I can't believe this. Anyway, he got the biggest grant in Canada to do studies into the connection between blood clots and COVID, because at the beginning they thought it was a blood disease and it wasn't, and that's why so many people died. And he started to write he's working on a musical about memory, and we were talking about when do you forget about the Holocaust? And I told him that I thought it was when the last person connected to it dies. I have no connection to Shabbat. My friend who's Shomer Shabbos is very, she says, yeah, I cry. I said, Zipporah, you cry like you cry for the Holocaust, for your husband's relatives in the Holocaust? She said, yes, but I don't feel that way. To me, so that's what I told him, and he was thinking about it, and then he started to work on a musical, and then now it's still the same theme to do with memories of connection with the Holocaust. And I told him he had to give me credit, even if I wasn't alive. He had to mention my name. That's why I told you about what he does, hematologist, to let you know that he's very talented. I don't know why I told you that. They're all very, very talented kids. I'm very lucky. I'm a very lucky woman.
Is there I kind of asked all my questions. Do you have anything that you would like to add or you would like to talk about that I didn't touch on?
No, I think you've done a marvelous job. Thank you. I don't even know how to articulate what I really want from this experience. It's important that we don't assign grades to traumatic experiences, because that's what happened to me, and I bear witness to how damaging it is. I may not have mentioned it in this interview. It damaged my relationships. I have a lot of good friends of long-standing, 50 years. But having said that, as good and as close as we are, both with men and women, I never talked about this. I never talked about this with my husband, which I find astounding. Astounding. And somehow someone needs to take on the plight of the generation who wasn't acknowledged. We acknowledge children of Holocaust survivors. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors too, but there aren't groups for young kids. It wasn't ever a need in the community. And the children of Holocaust survivors are kids who were born in whatever country. So their experiences, I had no one to relate to. And I think that's something that's very important, not only with the Holocaust, with many, many issues. I think that's really what I want. I also have been thinking for a long time, and I started bits and pieces. I wanted to write something. And I started bits and pieces, and who knows, maybe this will help me. That's why I wanted to know if I can get a copy. We'll see.
How do you feel it damaged you? You say it damaged you that your experience was not taken as, not seriously, but was not graded as terrible as the experience of someone who was in a ghetto or camp.
Well, in fact, it was it's considered a privileged position to be in hiding, you know, whether you're hidden in a barn by some person who's not Jewish, or you had Aryan papers. That you were lucky, boy. How did you get those? Well, you had to have money, obviously. But so it puts an onus on you that there's something that you did that was bad, and that's why you made it this far. It's not that you did something, it was good, and you're a shining star. No, if you're in Auschwitz and practically gassed, that's the height of it. Wow. But me, I mean, and when I make these sarcastic tones is because I myself believe that. I still haven't come to terms, but my analyst died. What are you going to do, eh?
Thank you, Roma.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert.